He hired her only to cook a single meal. She stayed 40 years and changed everything. And it began with nothing more than a plate of food set in front of a man who had forgotten what being cared for even felt like. Dusk settled over Bracken Ridge on a cold October evening in the year 1871, the kind of dusk that came early and stayed blue for a long time before it surrendered to full dark. Frost had already begun to silver the tips of the prairie grass, and somewhere out past the corral, a horse blew and stamped against the chill. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney of the log house, the only sign that anyone lived there at all, for the porch stood empty, the yard swept but silent, the windmill turning slow and creaking against a wind that smelled of coming snow, and the windows glowed with the low, lonesome light of a single lamp burning for a single man in a house that had once been built to hold much more than one, back before the county road had ever brought grief to its door. Inside, the table was set the way it had been set every evening for 3 years. One plate, one cup, one chair pulled close to the fire, and another left pushed back against the wall as though someone might still come to claim it. Eli Bracken ate his supper standing at the window more often than sitting at that table, watching the county road that ran along the ridge and rarely brought anyone down it, listening to the wind work at the shutters and the horses settle in the barn for the night. He did not yet know that before the week was out, a wagon small and travel-worn would creak over that same frozen road at dusk, and that the quiet he had spent 3 winters building around himself, log by log, silence by silence, was about to be undone by something as small and as ordinary as a meal. Eli Bracken had built Bracken Ridge with his own 2 hands, log by log, fence post by fence post, back in the years when he still believed a homestead was something a man raised for a family and not merely for himself to disappear inside of. He rose every morning a full hour before the sun, pulled on boots gone stiff with cold, and walked the same worn path to the barn that his own boots had carved a little deeper into the earth with every passing season, rain or frost or drifted snow. He fed the horses first, always the horses first, speaking to them in a low, even voice that he seemed to save entirely for animals now, as though the words meant for people had simply dried up somewhere inside him over the years and never found their way back to the surface. The mares knew the sound of his step before he ever reached the gate. The county had never seen a man gentler with a spooked colt, nor quieter with everyone else who crossed his path. And the 2 facts, most folks agreed, were not unrelated. In the log house, very little had changed in 3 years, and that, more than anything else, was the trouble of it. Margaret's rocking chair still sat by the hearth, angled just so toward the fire the way she had always kept it, the seat worn smooth in the exact shape of a woman who was no longer there to fill it. He dusted that chair every Sunday out of some habit he had never examined too closely, though he could not have said, if pressed hard enough, whether it was reverence or simply an inability to let even the dust settle where she once had sat with her mending in her lap. Her Bible rested closed on the shelf above the mantel, the ribbon still marking the very passage she had been reading the winter she died, and Eli had not once opened its cover since, though he could recite that verse from memory whether he wanted to carry it with him or not, and most days he did not want to. For the whole of the first year he had set 2 plates at every supper, out of some stubborn refusal to accept what the rest of the county had already quietly accepted for him. By the 2nd year he had finally stopped, folding the 2nd plate away into the back of the cupboard where it remained, clean and untouched, gathering the particular kind of dust that comes not from neglect, but from a thing being deliberately, carefully avoided. The chair across from his own stayed pushed back against the wall, present but unused, a silent witness to every meal he ate alone in a house built for the sound of more than one set of footsteps. And in time he grew so practiced at not looking toward it that the not looking became its own kind of quiet ritual, performed 3 times a day without fail, a small private ceremony no one else on the ranch was ever meant to witness, though Ezra had long since noticed it and simply never said a word about what he saw. The storm that took her had come in hard and fast out of the northwest on a February night 3 winters past, the kind of storm the old-timers at the Coldwater Mercantile still spoke of with a slow shake of the head whenever the wind picked up in a certain way. Eli had been 3 miles out that evening, chasing a herd of horses scattered wild across the open prairie by the first crack of thunder, certain in his bones that he had hours yet before Margaret's time came upon her, certain enough that he had ridden out and left her with nothing but the midwife's steady promise to send a boy for him the moment anything changed. By the time he finally fought his way home through driving sleet, half frozen through and half blind with cold. It was already over, the child gone right along with her, and the gray-faced midwife would not meet his eyes when she told him afterward that there had been nothing at all anyone could have done differently, least of all him. He had chosen, in the years since that night, to believe otherwise anyway, because a man convinced of his own guilt rarely accepts absolution simply for being offered it, and no one in the county had ever offered it plainly enough to break through. The midwife's words became a kind of penance he recited to himself in the dark hours before dawn, a debt he had quietly decided he would spend the rest of his living days repaying, though no living soul had ever asked that particular payment of him, and no one ever would think to. Grief. The narrator might say if grief could ever be persuaded to speak plainly through a man's own stubborn silence, does not always arrive as a wound that bleeds hot and then closes over with a scar a man can point to and name. Sometimes it arrives instead as a door quietly shut, and shut again each following morning, until the shutting itself becomes the whole of a man's private religion, practiced daily whether he means to or not, long after the reason for the first closed door is blurred at the edges. Ezra Pike had worked Bracken Ridge for 20 years now, first under Eli's father and then under Eli himself, and he had watched the boy he once taught to rope a calf in the spring mud grow into a man who flinched, ever so slightly, at the ordinary word supper. Ezra never spoke of it directly, not being a man given much to speeches or to prying where he had not been invited, but he left small offerings at the edge of Eli's silence the way a careful hand leaves feed at the edge of a shy animal's territory, hoping without pressing. A joke about the weather here, a mention of a neighbor's new foal there, anything at all that might coax a few extra words out of a man who had once talked easily enough over a shared fence and now measured his every sentence like a miser counting coin by lamplight, saving what little he had left to spend on no one at all, not even himself. The garden Margaret had once kept behind the house had gone to weed that very first summer after she died, and it had stayed that way every summer since, the fence sagging at its corners, the beds long since choked over with prairie grass reclaiming what her hands had once coaxed patiently into rows of beans and squash and sweet corn. Eli walked past that garden every single day on his way to the barn, and never once stopped to pull so much as a single weed from it, as though tending it might require him to admit, in some small and daily act of ordinary care, that she was truly and permanently gone, and that the garden now belonged to absolutely no one at all, a small square of wilderness he let grow because grieving it felt easier than reclaiming it. The circuit preacher rode through Coldwater twice a year on his long loop between the scattered homesteads, worn Bible in his saddlebag, and a patient man's way of never pushing where he had not been invited to push, and twice a year, without fail, he stopped his tired horse at the gate of Bracken Ridge. Twice a year Eli met him there rather than at the door, thanked him kindly for the trouble of the ride, and sent him on toward the Hollister place down the county road without so much as a cup of coffee offered against the cold. The preacher never once took offense at it. He simply noted, each visit, that the man's eyes looked a little more tired than they had the visit before, and rode on praying for him the quiet way a patient man prays for a door he trusts will open eventually, in its own good time, and not one moment sooner, no matter how many seasons that patience might ask of him. It is a strange thing the narrator would have you understand about grief, that a strong man is rarely undone all at once by a single terrible blow, however hard that blow may land. More often he is undone the slower way a fence post is undone, not by the storm that first sets it leaning, but by 3 long winters of frost afterward, heaving the ground beneath it a little further out of true with each passing season, until one ordinary day it simply gives way at last, and no one standing nearby could tell you with any certainty which particular winter had finally done it. Bracken Ridge had watched this happen to its owner the way land watches everything, patiently, without comment, keeping its own record of a man's slow unraveling in the state of his fences, his garden, and the empty chair he dusted every Sunday without fail. Even the horses seemed to sense it, the particular quiet of a household run by one grieving man rather than a family, and Eli sometimes caught himself talking to them longer than the work required, telling the mares things he would never have said aloud to another person, about the ache that came and went with the seasons, about the second plate he still sometimes thought to set before catching himself, about a life that had narrowed down to fences and feed and the slow turning of the windmill overhead. The horses only flicked their ears and went on chewing. And Eli found that a kind of comfort too, the comfort of being heard without being answered, without being asked to explain himself to anyone at all. So it was that on this October evening, with the last violet light draining slow out of the western sky and the temperature dropping fast enough to numb a man's fingers against the porch rail, Eli Bracken had no reason whatsoever to expect that anything in his carefully guarded world was about to change. He had banked the fire for the night, checked on the horses twice over as he always did before turning in, and was reaching for the door latch to go inside when something out on the county road caught the corner of his eye, a shape moving slow and deliberate against the darkening horizon, a shape that had no ordinary business being there at this hour, drawing closer with every passing minute toward a homestead that had not welcomed a stranger past its gate in longer than Eli Bracken cared to count, and would not stay a stranger for very much longer at all. The wagon that came down the county road was small and travel-worn, its wheels rimmed with the dried red mud of 100 miles, its canvas cover patched more than once with a careful, even hand that clearly did not believe in wasting good cloth. A single mule pulled it, plodding steady despite the cold, and behind the mule walked a woman leading it by a length of rope rather than riding, as though she had long since learned to spare the animal whatever weight she could, mile after mile, regardless of what it cost her own tired legs. She wore a gray wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and her dark hair was pinned back tight beneath a bonnet that had seen better winters, but she walked with her chin level and her shoulders square, the walk of a woman who had decided, somewhere many miles back, that she would not arrive anywhere looking like she was asking for anything at all, whatever the truth of her circumstances might actually be underneath that steady posture. Behind her, holding tight to a smaller hand, walked a boy of perhaps 8 years old, solemn-faced beneath a hat too large for him, a hat that had likely belonged to a man once and now belonged only to the memory of one. Beside him walked a little girl of no more than 5, who kept glancing up at the log house on the ridge with open, unguarded curiosity, the only one of the three who had not yet learned to keep her face carefully still in front of strangers. Lashed to the side of the wagon, wrapped and tied with the particular care a person gives to something irreplaceable, hung a cast-iron cookpot, blackened with years of honest use, and pressed against the woman's chest beneath her coat, wrapped twice over in oilcloth against the weather, wrote a worn, leather-bound book that had clearly traveled every single mile of this journey, exactly as close to her heart as she could manage to keep it, closer even than the children she never once let stray more than an arm's length from her side. They had come the last 11 miles on foot since the wagon's off-wheel had cracked outside the Hollister place, the woman told herself later, though in truth, she had walked most of the journey from Coldwater regardless, saving the mule's strength for the load rather than her own tired legs, because a mule that gave out on the open prairie was a far worse trouble than a pair of sore feet ever could be. She had asked after Bracken Ridge at the Mercantile that morning, been told plainly by the shopkeeper's wife that the rancher out there kept to himself and was not known for hiring help of any kind, and had thanked the woman for the information and set out down the county road anyway, because asking was the only thing left she had not yet tried. Eli watched them come from the porch, his hand still resting on the door latch, and made no move either to welcome them or to turn them away. It was not his custom to rush toward strangers on his road, and something in the woman's own unhurried pace told him she was not the sort to expect otherwise. The wagon slowed at the edge of the yard, well short of the porch steps, and there it stopped, the woman drawing the mule up with a soft word and standing beside it a moment, taking in the house, the barn, the man on the porch, with the same careful, unhurried attention she seemed to give everything. She did not call out a greeting from that distance, and she did not send the children ahead of her to soften the approach the way some might have. Instead, she simply stood, one hand still resting on the mule's neck, and waited, the boy at her side straightening a little as though bracing himself, the girl tugging once at her mother's sleeve before going still under some silent instruction Eli could not hear but understood perfectly well anyway, having given similar instructions himself once, long ago, before there had been anyone left to give them to. Eli came down off the porch at last, slow, his boots crunching over the frost-stiffened grass, and crossed the yard until he stood perhaps 10 feet from where the wagon had stopped, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and no closer. Up near, the woman's face showed the particular kind of tired that comes not from a single hard day, but from a great many of them strung together without much relief in between. Yet there was nothing broken in the way she held herself, nothing that asked to be pitied. Ezra had come out from the barn at the sound of the approaching wagon, and now stood off to one side near the corral fence, saying nothing, watching his employer approach three strangers with the particular stillness of a man ready to step in if the moment called for it, though something in Eli's unhurried walk told him this was not going to be the kind of moment that required stepping into. He had seen Eli turn away plenty of travelers over the years with a short word and a closed door, but he had never once seen him walk this slow and this deliberate toward anyone, as though some part of him already understood this exchange deserved more care than the usual. They stood like that a long moment, the two of them, taking each other's measure in the failing light the way two people do who have each buried someone and learned, in the burying, to stand very still with the weight of it rather than let it show on their faces. Eli had met plenty of strangers in his life who wanted something from him and made it plain within the first breath. This woman wanted something too. He could see that much in the set of her jaw, but she was not about to make it easy on herself by rushing to say so. The wind picked up, carrying the first hard bite of the night's frost across the yard and pulling at the hem of the woman's coat, and the little girl shivered once against her brother's side, though she did not complain of it, having learned somewhere along their long journey that complaints changed nothing and only made the cold feel colder. The mule shifted its weight and blew out a long breath that hung white in the cold air between them all. Somewhere behind Eli in the barn, one of the horses stamped and went quiet again, and still the woman said nothing, only watched him, until at last, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed a thing many times over many miles and means to say it exactly right the first time, she drew one steady breath and opened her mouth to speak. She told him plain, without a single word wasted, that she had heard in Coldwater he needed a proper supper cooked for a cattle buyer coming through within the week, and that she would cook it for him for a fair evening's wage, nothing more asked and nothing less accepted. She said it looking him straight in the eye the whole while, the way a man looks at another man when money is on the table between them, and Eli understood at once that this was not a woman come to his door for charity. He did not answer right away. He looked at her a long moment, then at the two children behind her, then back at her again, weighing something silently behind his eyes that she could not read and did not try to. When he finally spoke, his voice came out rougher than he meant it, asking only whether she could cook and whether she expected to be paid before the meal or after it was proven fit to eat. Something about the directness of it struck Eli harder than he expected, a small crack in 3 years of careful armor, for he could not recall the last time anyone had spoken to him without either fear or false cheer in their voice, plain and level as one hired hand addressing another. He thought, unbidden, of Margaret's own way of naming a thing plainly rather than dancing around it, and pushed the thought aside as quickly as it came, telling himself this was business and nothing more, though some quieter part of him already suspected otherwise. Her name, she told him, was Cora Whitfield, and she had cooked for railroad crews 40 men wide and for church suppers that fed half the county, and she would take her payment after, same as any hired hand would, because she was not asking him to trust a stranger, only to pay for a job done well. Her husband Daniel had died of fever 2 winters back, on a wagon train stalled 3 days outside Coldwater by washed-out roads, and she had buried him herself in ground she did not know, with borrowed tools and her children standing quiet beside her, because there had been no one else left to do it, and she had not asked anyone to. She said all of this without her voice once catching, the way a person speaks of a thing they have already grieved all the way through and come out the other side of, and Eli, who knew something of that particular kind of steadiness himself, found he had nothing to say back to it that would not sound like pity, and pity, he understood already without being told, was the one thing this woman would not accept from him or from anyone. If you are watching this tonight, wherever in the world that happens to be, the narrator would tell you. Take a moment now to write in the comments below exactly what town or country you are watching from, and if this story of Bracken Ridge has found its way to you the way old stories find their way to a fire on a cold night, consider subscribing to hear the rest of it, and leave the video a like before Cora Whitfield ever steps foot inside that kitchen, because what happens at that supper table is only the beginning of what these two lonesome souls are about to build together. Behind her, Jem had gone very still, watching the exchange with the careful attention of a boy who had learned to read grown men's negotiations for what they meant to his own family's future, while Lucy simply studied Eli's face with an open curiosity that held none of her brother's wariness, as though she had already decided, on no evidence at all beyond instinct, that this quiet, weathered man was not someone to be afraid of. Eli studied her a moment longer, then nodded once, short and businesslike, the way he might have closed a deal on a good horse. He told her the terms plain, one evening only, the wage settled before she started, so there would be no argument after, and she was to understand it was work he was paying for, and nothing beyond that. No favor owed on either side once the meal was served and eaten. Cora answered that she understood him perfectly, because it was exactly the arrangement she had come intending to propose herself. They shook on it there in the yard, her hand small and work-roughened in his. The whole transaction settled in under 5 minutes between two people who had each learned the hard way not to trust easy kindness. Ezra, who had drifted over from the barn at some point during the exchange without either of them quite noticing, stood a little apart with his hat pushed back, watching it all unfold with the particular satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time to see his employer speak more than 3 sentences together to another living soul. And he went back to his chores afterward whistling a tune no one at Bracken Ridge had heard him whistle in longer than anyone could readily recall. The children were shown toward the barn to wait out of the cold while their mother worked, Jem already eyeing the horses with an interest he could not quite keep off his solemn face, and Cora climbed the porch steps behind Eli toward a kitchen that had not smelled of anything but coffee and burnt bacon in longer than either of them cared to admit. Neither one of them said aloud what they were both quietly wondering, whether one evening's honest work could possibly hold steady against 3 years of a man's carefully guarded silence, or whether by morning this would all prove to have been nothing more than a single warm meal shared between two strangers who would go their separate ways come sunrise. The supper Cora Whitfield set on Eli Bracken's table that first night was nothing extravagant, only pan-fried venison, boiled potatoes, and a round of cornbread baked golden in a skillet she had brought with her own 2 hands. But it was the first meal cooked in that kitchen in 3 years with any intention beyond simply keeping a man alive until morning. Eli ate slower than he meant to, savoring it in a way that embarrassed him a little once he noticed himself doing it. And when the cattle buyer from Helena finally arrived an hour later and sat down to the very same table, he remarked twice, entirely unprompted, on the quality of the cooking, and shook Eli's hand afterward on a fair price for the horses, without half the haggling Eli had braced himself for that morning. When the buyer had ridden off satisfied into the dark, Eli stood a long moment on the porch with Cora, the children already half asleep against the wagon wheel behind them, and found himself saying words he had not planned at all, that the ranch could use a cook through the coming winter if she was willing, room in the old bunk cabin for her and the children, wages fair and paid regular, work and nothing more than work asked or offered on either side. Cora studied him a moment in the lantern light, weighing it the way she seemed to weigh everything in life now, and said simply that she would take the offer, on the plain, understanding that she earned her own keep and owed no one anything beyond an honest day's labor fairly given. Eli said that suited him fine, because owing was not a thing he had had much use for either, not since long before she ever arrived at his gate. The first weeks passed in the careful testing way 2 wary animals circle a shared water trough before either will drink from it in the other's presence. Cora kept mostly to the kitchen and the bunk cabin, rose before Eli did most mornings, and had coffee going by the time he came in, stamping the cold off his boots from the barn, never speaking more than the day's business strictly required of her. Eli, for his part, began setting his own boots by the door instead of tracking mud clear across her clean-swept floor, a small courtesy he offered without comment, and she accepted without remark. And in that quiet, wordless exchange of small considerations, something between them began, almost against both their better judgment, to soften by inches. Jem took to the horses faster than anyone at Bracken Ridge expected of a boy his age, spending every spare hour perched at the corral fence watching Eli work a green colt through its paces, until one gray morning Eli simply handed him a curry comb without a single word and let him brush down the gentlest mare in the whole string. The boy worked with a seriousness well beyond his 8 years, careful and quiet and exact, and Eli found himself explaining things to him he had not explained to another living soul since his own father taught him those same lessons on this very same ground. The weight of a hand, the reading of an ear laid back in warning, the patience a spooked animal required and would, in its own time, always repay in kind. Lucy proved much harder to keep at any careful distance. Being a child who had not yet learned that grown men sometimes preferred to be left entirely alone with their silence, she trailed Eli to the barn most mornings entirely uninvited, chattering at the horses and at him in equal cheerful measure. And one cold afternoon in November, without asking permission of anyone at all, she simply reached up and took hold of two of his fingers with her small hand as they walked together toward the house, looking up at him with an expectation so plain and so trusting that Eli, who had not let a child take hold of his hand in 3 long years, found he could not bring himself to pull away from her. Christmas that first year came quiet at Bracken Ridge, quieter than any Eli had marked since before Margaret died, but not empty the way the 2 Christmases before it had been. Cora roasted a goose Ezra had traded a day's fence work for, and Lucy strung dried berries into a garland she insisted on hanging above the mantel, despite Eli's mild protest that the ranch had never bothered with such decoration before. He let her hang it anyway, and found himself glancing at it more than once over the following days with something that felt, against all his careful expectation, uncomfortably close to contentment. Ezra watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, saying little as was his custom. Though one evening over the woodpile he told Eli plainly that the ranch had not sounded like this in longer than he cared to remember, meaning the particular sound of a child's voice carrying bright across the yard at dusk, mixed now with the low murmur of a woman singing while she worked. Eli, splitting kindling with rather more force than the task strictly required, admitted only that he supposed that was so, and said nothing further on the matter, though Ezra noted afterward, to no one in particular, that he had not denied it either. By the turn of the new year, Cora's presence in that kitchen had become simply a fact of the ranch, the way the windmill or the barn itself was a fact of it, and the second plate Eli had folded so carefully away 3 winters before found its way back onto the table without either of them ever remarking aloud on when exactly that quiet change had happened. Supper became, without either one naming it as such, the one hour of the day both of them seemed to look forward to more than any other. Cora asking after the horses and the weather, Eli asking after the children's lessons and their reading, the conversation still spare and careful, but no longer entirely silent the way it once had been. There was a hard morning in that same January when Jem, eager to prove himself, took the young gelding out past the far fence line without asking, and came home an hour later leading the limping animal on foot, having pushed it too fast over rough ground and strained a foreleg badly enough to need a week's rest. Eli's first instinct was sharp words, the kind his own father had used on him at that age, but he caught himself before they left his mouth, remembering some worn wisdom about a boy who had already lost one father figure to circumstance, and did not need to lose his footing with a second one over a single mistake with a horse. Instead, he knelt down, examined the leg himself, and explained calmly what the boy had done wrong and how to read the ground better next time. And Jem, braced for anger that never came, listened to every word of it with an attention he had never given anyone quite so completely before. One Saturday in late January, the county held its winter social at the schoolhouse, and half of Coldwater turned out for fiddle music and cider despite the cold. Cora went along to help with the food, and somewhere past midnight, over the objections of his own better sense, Eli found himself pulled out onto the floor by Lucy's insistent tugging and Cora's amused, challenging look, and made to attempt a reel he had not danced since before Margaret died. He was terrible at it, stiff and half a beat behind the fiddle the whole time, and Cora laughed at him openly, without a shred of unkindness in it, and something in that particular easy laughter did more to thaw him than a dozen quiet suppers ever could have managed on their own. Not every soul in Coldwater looked kindly on the arrangement, however. Certain women at the general store took to murmuring behind gloved hands about a widow living under a bachelor's roof, respectable or not, and word of the talk eventually reached Cora's ears by way of a neighbor who thought she ought to know. Cora said nothing of it to Eli, not wishing to trouble him with a burden that was, in her mind, entirely hers to carry. But Jem overheard enough of it in town to come home troubled, asking his mother plainly one evening whether they would have to leave Bracken Ridge the way they had left everywhere else, and whether he ought not get too attached to a home that might not stay theirs. Cora had no easy answer to give her son that night, only the honest admission that she did not know for certain how long they would stay, and that uncertainty settled over the bunk cabin like a second winter all its own. It took a hard, unexpected snowstorm 2 weeks later, one that stranded the whole family together in the main house for 3 days, when the bunk cabin stove failed in the cold, before Jem finally began to understand that a home might be measured by something other than how many times it had been taken away from him before. Watching Eli teach him to whittle by the fire on the second night of that storm, patient and unhurried in a way no grown man had ever been with him before, Jem allowed himself, cautiously, to start believing otherwise. Spring brought with it the planting season, and with the planting season came a rhythm of long days that left little room for old wounds to fester the way they once had in the empty stretches of winter. Cora took to rising before dawn to have bread proofing by the time the men came in from the fields, and more than once Eli caught himself standing a moment too long in the kitchen doorway, just to watch her work, flour dusting her forearms, humming some hymn under her breath without seeming to notice she was doing it at all, and he would turn away before she caught him at it, though not quickly enough every single time. Have you ever sat down to a single meal that changed the way you saw the person across the table from you? The narrator would ask you now, watching this quiet ranch kitchen fill slowly with a warmth it had not held in years, because that is precisely what was happening here at Bracken Ridge, one ordinary supper at a time. Neither Eli nor Cora quite willing yet to call it anything more than work, though anyone watching closely enough could see plainly that it had already become something else entirely. The real trouble came the following spring, though no one at Bracken Ridge could have guessed it that quiet winter before, watching the snow melt off the ridgeline with nothing but ordinary hope for the season ahead, when the rains that should have soaked the valley by April failed to arrive at all, and the creek that fed Bracken Ridge's herd shrank week by week to a thin brown ribbon winding through cracked, sun-baked mud. Eli rode the fence line each morning with a knot of worry in his chest he had not carried in years, watching the grass go pale and brittle far earlier than it should have, counting the horses against the dwindling water and not liking the arithmetic of it one single bit. Cora, watching him ride out grim-faced each dawn, began without being asked to haul extra water from the well to the trough nearest the house, her sleeves rolled and her hands blistered by the second week of it, never once complaining of the extra labor added onto a job she had already agreed to for far less trouble than this. The worst of the drought came in June, when one of the best mares, heavy with foal and weakened badly by the thin grazing, went down hard in the north pasture on a night black as pitch, and Eli sent Jem running for Cora before he had even finished saying aloud what was wrong. Cora came at a dead run across the yard with a lantern and an old wool blanket, dropping to her knees in the mud beside Eli without one moment's hesitation, and the two of them worked through the small hours of that long night together, Eli's hands sure and practiced from long years of it, Cora's steady and unflinching despite never having done such a thing before, both of them talking low and constant to the laboring mare in the particular voice creatures in pain seemed to understand better than any words spoken to a person ever could. The foal came near dawn, small and slick and impossibly still for one long, terrible moment, before it finally drew breath and struggled up onto legs like wet driftwood. And Eli, exhausted and mud-streaked clear to the elbows, let out a sound that startled even himself, a short, disbelieving laugh, the very first he had allowed himself in 3 long years of careful silence. Cora looked up at him from where she knelt in the churned mud, her own face streaked with dirt and lantern smoke, and laughed right along with him. And for one unguarded moment in the gray light before sunrise, two people who had each spent years learning how to carry grief without ever letting it show, simply let themselves be glad about something together, plainly and without apology. Word of the mare and the foal saved together in the black of that drought night spread through the county before the week was out, the way any good story spreads faster than any bad one ever seems to, and more than one neighbor stopped by in the following days simply to see the little horse called Dawn and to remark, in the easy way of people who had known the Bracken family a long while, how good it was to see Eli looking like himself again. Or perhaps one or two of the older women dared to say outright, looking like a better version of himself than anyone in Coldwater had seen since before Margaret passed. They named the foal Dawn, at Lucy's firm insistence once she was told the whole story over breakfast the next morning, and in the weeks that followed, something in Eli seemed to loosen that had been clenched tight since a February night 3 winters back. He began lingering at the supper table well past the last bite of food, asking Cora questions about her life before Coldwater, about Daniel, about the mother whose recipe book she still carried wrapped in oilcloth against the weather. And one warm evening in July, with the windows open to a soft prairie breeze and the children long since asleep, he found himself telling her, for the very first time since it happened, the whole of what took place the night Margaret died, the storm, the scattered herd, the 3 slow miles he had ridden home too late to matter. Cora did not offer him easy comfort, nor tell him plainly that it had not been his fault, understanding perhaps better than anyone else in the whole county could that such words, however kindly meant, would only have sounded hollow to a man who had spent 3 long years constructing his own private verdict against himself. Instead, she simply listened, all the way through to the end, without once looking away from him, and when he finally fell silent, she said only that Margaret must have been a fortunate woman, to have been loved so thoroughly that her absence could still undo a strong man 3 winters on, and that grief like his was not a debt still owed, but a kind of love with nowhere left to go. And perhaps, she added quietly, it had finally found somewhere after all. There was a Sunday in late August, not long after the rains finally returned, when the whole household rode into Coldwater together for church for the first time, as something that looked, to anyone watching from the pews, very much like a family. Eli sat between Jem and Lucy in the bracken pew that had stood empty on that side for 3 years, Cora beside him with her hands folded and her chin level as ever, and the preacher, glancing down at them from the pulpit mid-sermon, allowed himself the smallest of smiles before continuing on, as though some quiet prayer of his own had finally, after 2 years of patient visits to a closed gate, been answered. The drought broke at last in August, with 3 full days of steady rain that turned the Crack Creek bed back into a running stream and brought the grass back green again almost overnight. Jem, who had earned his own gelding that summer through months of faithful, unasked-for work in the barn, rode the fence lines now alongside Eli most mornings, no longer trailing along behind, but riding as something closer to a true partner than a boy underfoot. Lucy had taken to calling Eli by his first name alone some time back in June, dropping the mister without anyone ever correcting her for it, and it had simply stuck, spoken now by the whole family without a second thought given to it. Ezra took Jem aside one afternoon that same summer, while Eli was off mending fence, and told him plainly, in the way an old ranch hand tells a boy something he judges the boy is finally ready to hear, that he had known Eli Bracken since before Jem was born, had watched him bury a wife and a child he never got to name, and had not once, in all those hard years between, seen him laugh the way he had laughed the night that foal was born. Whatever doubts you're still carrying about this place being home for good, Ezra told him, you can set most of them down now, because a man does not laugh like that around people he means to send away. By harvest time, the garden behind the house that had gone to weed for 3 long summers running was green again with beans and squash and sweet corn, the fence mended, the rows straight and tended with the same patient care Margaret herself had once brought to that same soil, Cora having asked permission before ever touching it, and Eli having given that permission without one moment's hesitation, understanding somehow that her tending it was not an erasure of Margaret, but a continuation of something Margaret herself would surely have wanted kept alive and growing. The county noticed the change too, neighbors remarking openly at church socials how Bracken Ridge looked lived in again after all these years, how Eli Bracken had started coming to service some Sundays now instead of turning the preacher away at the gate, how there was laughter audible from the yard some evenings if a body rode close enough along the road to hear it carry. Cora, for her part, wrote a single letter that autumn to her late husband's sister back east, the first she had sent in over a year, and told her plainly that she and the children had found steady work and a decent roof at a horse ranch called Bracken Ridge, and that for the first time since Daniel died, she had stopped counting the days until the next hard thing happened, and started, instead, simply living the days as they came, one at a time, the way a person does when they have finally stopped bracing for the ground to give way beneath them. A second winter passed at Bracken Ridge much gentler than the first 3 had been, and then a portion of a second spring besides, the ranch settling into a rhythm none of them spoke of aloud, but all of them had come, quietly and separately, to depend upon. Cora's recipe book stayed open on the kitchen shelf now, instead of wrapped away in oilcloth, its pages soft and stained with use, added to here and there in Eli's own blunt hand whenever she taught him a trick of the kitchen he insisted on learning for himself. Jim had grown a full inch and lost the wary set to his shoulders that had marked him the day he first walked up that county road, and Lucy had taken, without anyone quite noticing when it started, to falling asleep most evenings against Eli's side by the hearth, in the very chair that had once been pushed back, unused, against the wall. By that second autumn, Eli had begun, without quite admitting it to himself, to notice small things about Cora he had no honest business noticing in a woman he still insisted, whenever Ezra teased him about it, was simply his hired cook. The particular way she hummed while kneading dough, the patient, unhurried way she answered every one of Lucy's endless questions without once losing her temper, the steady, level way she still looked a man in the eye when money or truth was on the table between them, exactly as she had that first evening in the yard. He said none of this aloud to anyone, but Ezra, watching them both across the supper table one evening, caught Eli's eye lingering a beat too long on Cora's face and said nothing about it either, only allowed himself a small, private smile over his own plate. None of them, not Eli, not Cora, not even sharp-eyed Ezra, had any notion at all that their quiet, hard-won peace was already being noticed in Coldwater, for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with laughter or gladness. In a narrow office above the bank on Main Street, a man in a well-cut coat and city boots that had never once touched a plow had begun asking careful, pointed questions about the deed to Bracken Ridge, about the note still owed against it, and about exactly how much that particular stretch of valley might be worth to a railroad company looking to run a spur line straight through the very heart of it. Silas Vane arrived at Bracken Ridge on a bright September morning in a hired buggy far too clean for the county road it had traveled, wearing a coat cut in a city fashion that had no business anywhere near a working ranch, and smiling the particular smile of a man who has already decided how a conversation is going to end before it has properly begun. He introduced himself as the note holder on the Bracken property, a fact Eli already knew perfectly well from his father's day, and shook Eli's hand with a grip a shade too firm to be entirely friendly, and remarked, almost in passing, what a fine, prosperous-looking spread it had become in recent seasons. The fences mended, the garden green, the whole place fairly humming with life where once it had sat so quiet. He came to the point soon enough. Once he had been offered coffee out of politeness, Eli would later regret extending. The note on Bracken Ridge, he explained, pleasant as ever, had grown a good deal larger over the lean years than most folks realized, compounded interest being what it was, and the bank was now prepared to call the balance due in full within 30 days, a courtesy notice rather than a demand, he was careful to say, though the paper he laid on the table said otherwise in language plain enough for any man to read. He added, almost as an afterthought, that a railroad company scouting a spur line through the valley had expressed considerable interest in the land, and that he personally would be glad to arrange a generous buyout that would spare Eli the unpleasantness of a formal foreclosure proceeding in front of the whole county. Eli read the paper twice through in silence, while Vane sipped his coffee and admired the view out the kitchen window as though he already owned it. When Eli finally spoke, his voice was level in a way that cost him considerable effort, asking plainly whether 30 years of his family's note being paid faithfully and on time counted for nothing at all against one difficult stretch of years. And Vane's smile did not so much as flicker as he explained, with the practiced patience of a man who had delivered this same speech in a dozen other kitchens across the county. That business was business, and that sentiment, however understandable, had no place on a ledger. Cora had stood silent by the stove through the whole exchange, her hands gone still on the dish towel she held, and it was only after Vane's buggy had rattled back down the county road that she finally spoke, asking Eli plainly what 30 days would mean for the horses, for the children, for all of it. Eli had no honest answer to give her, and the not having one sat heavier on him than the dead itself. That night he did not sleep, pacing the length of the porch under a hard, clear sky full of stars, and Cora, watching from the kitchen window, understood without being told that whatever peace this family had built together over the past year now hung on something entirely outside either of their control. The fear settled into the house quietly, but completely over the following days, the way smoke settles into wool and will not wash out easily. Cora found herself, almost without deciding to, folding a few of the children's things into a trunk one evening. Not packing exactly, she told herself, only tidying, though Jem caught her at it and understood immediately what it meant. Old enough now, and had been made old enough too many times before, to recognize the particular silence of a family bracing to lose a home. He asked her plainly at supper whether they would have to leave, and Cora, who had never once lied to her children even when a lie would have been kinder, told him honestly that she did not know, and that they would face whatever came the same way they had faced everything else, together and without running from it beforehand. Lucy, still too young to fully understand the shape of the trouble, only understood that the grown-ups had gone quiet at the table in a way that frightened her more than any plain explanation could have, and she took to climbing into Eli's lap uninvited some evenings, saying nothing, simply pressing her small face against his shirt as though she might hold the whole ranch together through sheer force of wanting it to stay whole. Eli held her without a word, staring past her at the empty stretch of prairie through the window, doing arithmetic in his head that never once came out in his favor, no matter how many times he ran the numbers. News of the trouble at Bracken Ridge traveled fast down the county road the way news of trouble always does, and by the second week, half of Coldwater had an opinion on it, some quietly sympathetic, others whispering that a man who had let his ranch slide for 3 grieving years had only himself to blame for the debt catching up to him now. Cora heard both kinds of talk at the mercantile and said nothing back to either, keeping her chin level the way she always had, though it cost her more now than it once had, with so much more standing to be lost than her own pride alone. Would you have trusted a man like Silas Vane, smiling and reasonable, and dressed in his fine city coat? Or would you have seen, the way Cora and Eli both saw plainly enough by the second visit, the wolf standing patient behind that smile, waiting only for the right moment to close its jaws? The narrator would ask you now, because the whole county was about to find out exactly which kind of man Silas Vane truly was, and not everyone in Coldwater would be glad to learn it. Vane returned twice more over the following 2 weeks, each visit a little less patient than the last, each visit sweetening the buyout offer just enough to make refusing it look, on paper at least, like plain foolishness to anyone who did not know what that land had cost Eli Bracken to hold on to, and what it had finally, after 3 hard years, given back to him in return. On his final visit, he grew openly impatient, reminding Eli in a voice gone considerably less pleasant than before that the 30 days were very nearly spent, and that the bank's patience, unlike the valley's rain, was not an inexhaustible resource. Ezra found Eli in the barn late that same cold night, sitting alone on an overturned bucket in the dark, with the deed to Bracken Ridge unfolded carefully across his knees. Jem had taken to doing extra chores unasked all that final week, mucking stalls before dawn and mending fence past dusk, as though hard work alone might somehow hold the ranch together through sheer stubborn effort, the way he had once watched his own mother hold their small family together through nothing but the same relentless, uncomplaining labor. And Eli had noticed it without saying so, staring now at his own father's signature on a document he had never once expected to lose. Ezra said little, as was his way, only that whatever Eli decided to do, he would stand behind him for it, same as he had stood behind this family for 20 years, and did not intend to stop now on account of one man in a fine coat. Eli thanked him quietly and asked to be left alone a while longer, and Ezra went, though he did not go far, settling himself instead on the porch steps of the main house where he could still see the lantern light burning steady in the barn. Cora came to him once, the night before the last day of the notice, and offered plainly to go to the bank herself and speak on his behalf, or to take work in town if it would help toward the sum, anything at all rather than sit idle while the thing they had built together came apart around them. Eli told her no, gently but firmly, that this particular debt was his to answer for, his father's name on the paper and his own failures of the past 3 years behind it, though the offer itself, freely given without a moment's hesitation, settled something in him he could not afterward put into words. By the last morning of the 30 days, with frost thick on the ground and the whole ranch holding its breath, Eli rose before anyone else was stirring, dressed in silence, and saddled his horse alone in the gray dark of the barn. He folded the deed carefully into his coat pocket, said nothing to Cora or the children still sleeping in the house, and rode out onto the county road toward Coldwater with no plan that Ezra, watching from the porch with a cup of cold coffee going colder in his hand, could begin to guess at. And no one at Bracken Ridge that morning had the first idea whether the man riding away from them would come home again with the ranch still standing, or with nothing left at all. Eli found Silas Vane at the county assessor's office by mid-morning, papers already spread flat across the clerk's desk as though the outcome had been settled before Eli ever rode into town at all. A small crowd of townsfolk had gathered outside, drawn by word of the foreclosure moving fast down Main Street, among them neighbors who had known the Bracken name 3 full generations deep, watching now through the window with folded arms and grim, waiting faces. Eli laid the deed down flat on the desk between them and refused the buyout in a voice that did not shake, not once, though his hands were cold as he did it. He offered instead every dollar the ranch had earned honestly that whole year, counted out coin by coin in full view of the assessor and the gathering crowd, and asked the county to judge for itself whether Bracken Ridge was idle land fit only for a railroad spur or a working home built by working hands. Vane's smile finally slipped clean off his face. He argued the note was the note, figures were figures, and sentiment had no earthly place on a ledger. The same tired speech he had given already in Eli's own kitchen weeks before, delivered now a touch too loud, a touch too fast, for a man who had claimed all along to feel nothing at all about losing his prized piece of valley land, his gloved hands tightening on the edge of the clerk's desk in a way that gave the lie to every word of it. Eli answered him plain, his voice carrying easy to the back of the room. He said the ledger Vane kept so carefully counted only dollars, and had never once counted the mare saved together in a hard drought, the boy who earned his own horse through months of honest work, the little girl who fell asleep every single night now by that hearth. He said Cora Whitfield and her 2 children were his family, said it aloud, plainly, in front of the whole gathered town, for the very first time in his life. A murmur moved through the crowd at that, and it was not on Vane's side of the room. Neighbors who had eaten Cora's cooking at church socials, who had watched Bracken Ridge come slowly back to life over the past year, stepped forward one after another to vouch for a debt paid faithfully across 30 long years, and for the character of the man who had paid it without fail every single season. The assessor studied the crowd a long moment, then studied Vane, then studied the honest money counted out plain on the desk between them, and ruled the note settled in full, the balance forgiven against the plain weight of testimony the bank could not argue against, not standing there in front of half of Coldwater, watching every word of it unfold. Vane gathered his papers without another word spoken, his fine city coat suddenly looking a good deal less impressive than it had that first bright morning in Eli's own kitchen, and he left Coldwater for good within the week, the railroad spur quietly rerouted around a valley that had, in the end, simply refused to be for sale at any price a stranger in a fine coat had thought to offer it. Word of what happened at the assessor's office traveled faster down the county road than Eli himself could ride, and by the time he reached the turn toward Bracken Ridge that afternoon, half his neighbors already knew the note was settled and the land was safe, though none of them knew it half so well, nor felt it half so deep in the chest, as the man riding home slow beneath a wide autumn sky with the deed folded safe once more in his coat pocket. Eli rode home slow that whole afternoon beneath a wide, quiet sky, the fight won by nothing more than honest character and the plain word of neighbors who knew him true. What waited for him now at Bracken Ridge, past the mended fences and the green fields, and the family gathered on that porch to watch for his return, was no longer any question of bare survival, but of what shape this hard-won, ordinary life he had finally chosen for himself might yet be allowed to take. Eli and Cora did not rush toward anything in the seasons that followed, having both already learned what it cost to build a life on haste rather than on trust, earned slowly, day by day, over honest work. They simply kept on as they had been, raising Jem and Lucy together under one roof, tending the horses and the mended garden, letting whatever was growing between them grow at its own unhurried pace, the way the best things on a homestead always did. It was not until Jem stood nearly grown, and Lucy old enough herself to stand beside them at the altar, that Eli and Cora finally married one quiet Sunday at the Coldwater Church. No great fuss made of it. Only the people who had stood by them through the hardest years gathered close. 40 years came and went the way seasons do on a working ranch, one after another, each one leaving its own mark on the land and on the people who tended it faithfully. Ezra grew old in the bunkhouse and was buried at last beneath the cottonwood he had always favored. mourned by a family that had long since stopped being able to remember a version of Bracken Ridge without him standing somewhere in it. Jem took over the horses in time, then his own children after him, and Lucy raised a family of her own not 2 counties over, though she never once missed a harvest supper back at the ranch that had first taken her and her mother in as strangers off the county road. The place came to be known simply as Whitfield Bracken Ridge among the folks of Coldwater. The 2 names joined the way the 2 families had joined that October evening so long ago, over one meal that was only ever supposed to be a single evening's work and nothing more. Cora's recipe book, worn soft and split at the spine now, still sat open on the kitchen shelf where it had rested for 4 decades, its pages thick with the handwriting of daughters and granddaughters who had added their own recipes down beside her mother's and her own. The rocking chair that had once sat empty by the hearth for 3 long, grieving years was mended and repainted somewhere along the way, and it never once sat idle again in all the decades that followed, holding first Cora with a new baby, then grandchildren, then great-grandchildren in their turn, the wood worn smooth all over again by hands that had learned, generation after generation, that a house is only ever as empty as the people inside it allow it to remain. On quiet evenings, with grandchildren underfoot and the fire banked low, Eli would sometimes catch Cora's eye across that same table where it had all begun so long ago. And some things, the narrator would tell you, never do need saying aloud between 2 people who have spent 40 years choosing each other, morning after morning, meal after meal, through drought and grief and every ordinary season between. For it was never one supper alone that truly changed Eli Bracken's life, nor even one whole year of them, whatever the first evening might have seemed to promise. It was every ordinary day that followed after, each one chosen freely and without complaint, that slowly turned a single hired meal into a home, and a home, in the end, into a family that never once had to be asked to stay.